of Private Law, Scuola Superiore Santa Anna, and adjunct professor of private law at University of Pisa. And he's also director of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on the Regulation of Robotics and Artificial Intelligence. Mr. Bertolini, you're not specialized in agriculture, but your presentation is key, really, to understand the general frame so that everyone can understand the issues and what is at stake. You will give us some basic notions and straightforward elements on the different rules applied at the European level in terms of technology. So tell us, what is the legal frame and regulatory approach so far? What is the state of arts?
Okay, so thank you, Sophie, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I don't know if you can see my slides. So very briefly, I am going to introduce you to the very notion of civil liability, and I'll dive into the European framework applicable today to any advanced technology. And then I'll try to highlight some of its problematics, if some time is left, in a risk management perspective. So what is civil liability? Civil liability is basically defined as the set of rules that determine who is bound to pay damages, to compensate the victim once the victim suffers harm. So somebody is injured either through the use of a product or any other circumstance. Those are civil liability can either be based on specifically regulated hypotheses or also general clauses of liability. Each and every legal system has a general clause of liability and then also some specific hypothesis. We will see in a moment that there is product liability that is the most important of such specific hypothesis at European level. Typically, liability and civil liability in particular requires scienter or fault, basically that the party that is being held responsible can be considered negligent or violating a rule of law. But there are also some rules of liability that establish an objective or semi-objective liability of the party, meaning that there is no need to demonstrate the presence of scienter or fault. Now, it is very much debated whether advanced technologies, machines, robotics, and AI applications, because they are autonomous and sometimes possess the ability to learn, may be deemed agents and therefore directly responsible rather than holding a human being behind them responsible. There is a very provocative article from some years ago that says that even a smart thermostat, so that adjusts the temperature in a room, could be deemed an agent and therefore responsible. But those proposals are unacceptable, I would say, given the state of the art, because none of these machines can be actually considered a subject. I'm sorry, I hear a noise in the background. So we can safely say that as of today, but for the producer or programmer of any robotic or AI application, those machines, those applications would not possess those skills and abilities. And therefore, if by using such skills and abilities, those machines cause any harm to another human being, those that programmed or produced those applications may be held responsible in light of existing rules. And that is the existing legal framework that is overall fit for purpose, meaning those principles need not be changed. Now, you might have heard that at European level, some years ago, back in 2017, the European Parliament advanced a proposal for attributing machines, advanced machines, electronic personhood. Some people understood that as being the acknowledgement that machines are agents and therefore self-responsible. But that wasn't actually the case. What the European Parliament was proposing, among other alternatives, was to attribute personhood like it does to corporations, also to some kinds of advanced machines. That would be a purely instrumental concept, as I said, as we do attribute today such form of personality to corporations in order to separate a group of assets with which corporations can undergo their business. Similarly, you could separate a group of assets that the machine would use to do its own activity and also eventually compensate for the damages that it causes. This very notion of electronic personhood is, of course, was just a proposal, and it seems that there is no follow-up along this line. So this is not yet part of the European legal framework. This is also to say, and this is something that is very essential to understand. This was a citation by a famous Italian law professor that was also judge of the Italian Constitutional Court that says that law is not a brick that falls on our heads. Law is all around us. So this is to say, if overnight somebody of you invented the time machine to undergo time travel, that would immediately and already be regulated, meaning that if somebody suffered harm while using the time machine, even if there is no time machine specific regulation, those that got harmed using the time machine could sue the producer of the time machine in a court, and the judge would have to find a solution to that case with existing norms as the only available tool. This also allows me to say that it is not useful to debate whether or not we want technology to be regulated, because technology is already regulated the moment it comes into existence. Rather, we are only debating on what kind of legislation we want for it. So the only question is what will be good regulation, because everything is already regulated. At a European level, any machine existing today falls primarily under two different bodies of norms when liability is concerned. On the one hand, Product Liability Directive, the Product Liability Directive, and on the other hand, Product Safety Regulation. I think we will hear more about Product Safety Regulation, but I will spend a few words also on that. What is product safety regulation? Product safety regulation is that body of requirements that are set through primary legislation at European level that determine what a given application needs to meet in order to be considered safe and also to be then sold legally so on the European market. So if you want to sell any product on the European market, you have to identify what is the primary legislation, so eventually the Machinery Directive or similar bodies of legislation that are applicable to your specific technology, whereas the application of standards, international standards, is merely voluntary. So you might comply with the requirements of primary legislation also by not abiding to existing standards, if there is any. But you are still obliged to comply with the legislation. But that does not shield you from ex post liability. So this is a prerequisite in order for you to be able to sell your product onto the market, but it's not capable of limiting your exposed liability. Instead, when it comes to liability, all machines are products, and therefore product liability rules apply. And product liability rules aim at serving two purposes: making products safe and also ensuring that the victim that suffered harm is compensated. To do so, the Product Liability Directive holds the producer of the good strictly liable. So there is no need to show the negligence of the producer for all damages derived from the use of his device. Now, there are grounds to doubt at European level that this body of legislation is functioning properly as it should. There are a number of studies, and I'll be happy to pick up questions on that during the Q&A, but showing that there is a very limited litigation that allows the application of those norms. This is overall a way to say that these rules are not very fit for purpose in practice. It's very hard for claimants to demonstrate that the product was actually defective and therefore that the producer is obliged to compensate. And this causes a lot of concerns when it comes to advanced technologies. In particular, from a study that was performed by Ernst & Young back in 2018, it can be observed like product liability cases are often solved by judges applying different bodies of norms that were not specific for defective products. And this is a matter of concern that becomes greater when we consider advanced technologies such as robotics and AI, because those also have an intrinsic technological complexity that causes the ascertainment of the fundamental elements of liability to be very opaque and very costly. So this, you could see this as a useful thing in a producer's perspective. You can say, well, then if it's harder for victims to sue us in a court, we will will be favored somewhat, but that is not actually the case, because I did studies to show that this will slow the uptake of technology in many cases, because if users are do not feel safe around those kind of applications, they might not want to switch to the more autonomous versions and would rather keep the more traditional ones. So I came up with an alternative proposal that is called the risk management approach. I have applied this to different kinds of applications, in particular driverless cars, that I believe are a similar application to automation in agriculture. And in this perspective, I have demonstrated together with the professor of innovation management, so an economist, that if you held the producer absolutely liable under all circumstances, he would acquire insurance and transform exposed litigation that is an uncertain cost into a clear ex-ante cost that can be factored into the cost function for the production of any given technology, and in this case, driverless cars in particular, and then would transfer that cost to the final user, who would pay insurance through the resale price of the good. And that would allow, on the other hand, the victim to obtain compensation without any litigation, so minimizing litigation costs. And that would create huge advantages if considering advanced driverless cars that I said are a similar, even if not identical, technologies to driverless tractors. Well, we calculated with my colleague that the replacement of driverless cars would occur at a much earlier stage in light of such an approach, because it would make sense for the owner, so for the person that is going to purchase a vehicle and has the choice between a more advanced and a more traditional one, he would go for the more advanced one, so long as the driving capability of the more advanced one equals that of the average human driver. Whereas with the existing legal framework, we would be in the case in the left side, represented by the left side formula, and we would only opt for the more advanced solution when that is significantly more advanced and by large outperforming the average human driver. So this would come at a huge economic cost also for manufacturers. And that is it. Thank you. I cannot hear.
Presentation. Okay. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. I was just congratulating you for a very short, dense, and relevant presentation, Andrea. There is no question so far, but I believe they will come up a bit after. I have a couple questions, though. Can you tell us what are the trends at the European policy level, meaning are there any legislative initiatives being considered?
Yes, I also have some backup slides on this.
Sure.
Yes, so I think you can see them now. Yeah, so, well, as you might not know, because you're not lawyers, but the European Parliament does not possess legislative capacity. It's the European Commission that can adopt new legislation. However, in October 2020, the European Parliament adopted a proposal that was submitted to the European Commission, and therefore the Commission is now taking that into account, whereby they would like to introduce a single system of liability for all AI-based systems. So any tractor, any robot, any advanced machinery would fall under the notion of AI-based system, because it is defined as either software-based or embedded in hardware that displays behavior simulating intelligence by inter alia, collecting and processing data, analyzing and interpreting its environment, and by taking action with some degree of autonomy to achieve specific goals. So, for instance, an autonomous tractor would fall under the notion of AI system, and therefore this body of legislation would apply. And therefore, the operator of that technology, that could be anyone that is deploying the technology. So, for instance, the single farmer, the company to whom the tractor belongs to, and to some extent, also the producer would fall under the notion of operator. And the operator would be held strictly liable based on this legislation. So the European Parliament is considering holding each operator, and in this case it would be, the focus would really be on the company that is owning and using the tractor, or the single farmer would hold them strictly responsible for all damages that derive from the use of their device. with very limited possibility of freeing themselves from liability, and however, with a very limited compensation. So in this perspective, the responsible party, that could be both the single user that is operating the robot, or the company that is deploying the robot or selling the services of the robot as a service. They all might be responsible, and they would only be limited, however, to a damage cap up to 2 million euro in the event of death or serious physical harm to the victim. So in such cases, there is this damage cap that I'm a bit skeptical about, because it could be unconstitutional in many member states. So this part might be changed, but any operator, and this very notion of operator is very broad, as I tried to explain, might be held responsible in light of upcoming EU regulation. And they would be strictly so. So there would be no need to demonstrate any fault or scienter on the side of the operator. So this could be the next move. It's open to some criticism. I do believe that there's much room for improvement, but this is the line along which the European Parliament and European Commission might be moving in the near future. So this is something really, really relevant to keep in mind.
Sure, maybe you'll give us an update next year on that. There are some questions coming in the chat, but we'll take care of those after Monsieur GOSSARD's presentation. I have one last question for you, Andrea. Also, do you believe that there's some specificities for agricultural robotics that ought to be taken into account when conceiving regulation?
Yeah, so to some extent, yes, I do believe that all robotic applications are very different one from the other, in the sense that you cannot really find a one-fits-all solution. One-size-fits-all solution like the European Parliament is attempting to do. What appears to me to be peculiar about agricultural robotics is that it is used in quite segregated environments, meaning you don't have the problem of passersby or erratic behavior of unexpected people around, at least not to the same extent that you would have with a driverless car. So this is an element that should be taken into account when conceiving a regulation for agricultural robots. And then, of course, it's always a good approach to taking into account the specific technical features of all technologies. Now, as I said, I'm not a great expert of agricultural robotics, but I always have this bottom-up approach, and I do really think that it is necessary for conceiving new legislation. So even when it comes to, for instance, insurance is a tool to address some of the liability concerns. But it is not always the best tool. You have to look into the technology and also into the market for technology to understand whether there might be also a corresponding insurance market, because in some cases, let's say driverless cars, for sure there's going to be a profitable insurance market, and therefore I would expect to see an insurance company to be willing to enter that market. In other cases, I could doubt that more seriously, in the sense, for instance, if you consider biorobotics applications, agricultural robotics might be more similar to driverless cars than to biorobotics applications, but in that respect. But those specificities need to be taken into account, and studies taking into account the market structure for these technologies are also required in order to conceive correct legislation on that matter.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to hear Monsieur GOSSARD's presentation now, and then we'll address the question from the chat. Christophe GOSSARD, you will explain now how to comply with harmonized standards to assess the performance level specification described into the legal requirements.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. I will try to explain in certainly more simple terms. My company used to say we need to have the feet on the ground and the eye on the horizon. And I will say that this is what I will try to address in my presentation, because what we need to serve is the farmers and some solution for the future. Farming with no tractor driver, is it possible? So I will start first with this slide, because we have quite a lot of legacy in Europe. We have a system which is based on the homologation scheme and harmonized standard. And you have to differentiate different type of equipment. The robot is not here pictured, but it's I will say part of the second category. The tractor vehicle is specific in Europe due to the history, so they have their own regulation, and it's very complex, very difficult to handle. And I would say that you can keep busy a lot of people just managing the data to register your vehicle to comply with the type approval in Europe. And then you have the specific requirements for the member state and the different technical paperwork that you need to supply. So if we think about autonomous tractor, I think that we have two challenges, which is first to take care of safety and security, and secondly to make this administrative paperwork and the legal requirement around the authorization to put on the market this equipment not cumbersome. And this is where I will say we have definitely different options depending on the legal framework which is applying to the different products. So we have first, I will say that I do a bottom-up approach, and I start with the real constraint of the equipment. And if you have to validate the conformity of an equipment, which can potentially circulate on the public network, it's quite difficult because it's quite challenging regarding all the safety aspect. For the fields, it's a little different. Of course, you may have some bystander around, but the needs will be much lower. We have a good legislative framework in Europe. I have quite some colleagues in the US. When I challenge them, because they do the risk assessment, and they record the data related to the risk assessment. And in case of an accident, you have an army of lawyers chasing you to have something back from the different people who have had an accident related to the use of the machine. In Europe, we have a virtuous scheme, which is called the Machinery Directive, because you perform risk assessment based on harmonized standard or not harmonized standard, but it's voluntary, as Andrea mentioned, and we do the assessment through most of the time self-certification, which means that the manufacturer is in control and he has the capacity to perform the risk assessment if there is no standard available, which is the case for many of the new technology, based on some international standard or industry standard, but can be integrated into this risk assessment. And then you record the data and you can perform you can assess the performance level of your robot to determine if it is compliant to the risk which are described through the technical specification of the standard. Today, with this new technology, and when I say new technology, I mean integrating IoT device. I prefer to talk about machine learning instead of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity. It is all the different constraints that we need to integrate into the design of the equipment. And I will say that we should not fall into the trap of GDPR, like privacy, where we need to do development with privacy by design, where when you need to put something with the collaboration and interconnectivity of your equipment, you need to have a contract, and then you need a lawyer. I would prefer to go after some standard where the technical requirements are described and where you can determine, definitely provide the performance of your equipment, and you can record the data through some light administrative paperwork. And then through this new legislative framework, which has been used for the last 14 years, we can have the presumption of conformity, we can have the CE marking, and we can definitely put a safe product which will require some performance level at the level of the safety requirement that we have in the essential health and safety requirement of the Machinery Directive. And this is how you can mitigate the risk of potential litigation. Then you have also different technology, and one of them can be permission distributed ledger or private blockchain. And if you think about this type of technology, one of the advantages of this permission distributed ledger, which is also called private blockchain, you have traceability, authentication, and also compliance to some requirements. And I put into circle some of the advantages of this technology. You have accurate data, you have reliable data, you have also privacy and data production, which are also covered with encryption of the permission distributed ledger, and also the quality of the data are quite good, because usually from the sensor up to the platform, you have definitely the traceability and also the insurance that the data have not been tuned or modified. So through this traceability, authentication, and compliance, the permission distributed ledger is one of the technology which can save a lot of money, not only for the manufacturer, but also for the different company using this equipment, because you will comply to the different legislation that Andreas mentioned. And at the same time, you will have a status where you said that you have harmonized standard covering all these different legislation. I talk about GDPR. You have also low voltage directive, radio equipment directive, electromagnetic compatibility directive. So all this hardware and software which are deployed in this environment are providing, this cross-checking, where the data that you can track and upload into a platform, that this status of the sensor is reflecting the good operation of your equipment, which can be safe in the end of the farmer. And to make it short, we have quite some benefit for the industry, which are self-certification, as I said. You have also a risk which is lower. I mean, the market entry for the industry, and particularly for the small and medium enterprises, you cannot afford to have a department of lawyer, a department of homologation people taking care of all this risk around this autonomous vehicle. And also you cut unnecessary costs and avoid disproportionate administrative burden for the manufacturer. So this is certainly very short as a high-level description about the process to put on the market a product. But through this type of development, and today I can say that for not only tractors, but for combined harvesting machine, forage harvester, forestry equipment, sprayers, we have developed with the European Commission a draft for the technical content of a new regulation, and our attempt is in this future regulation to introduce some of this new technology to be sure that we can have some exemptions to drive on the public network. Because the most important for the farmer is that when you are in the farm, you don't want to bring the tractor to the field and after come back to the farm. If you could have one self-propelled machine going automatically to the field, of course, with proper assessment of the risk, you will have definitely the farmer taking care of the most interesting task that he has to focus on, taking care of the different product or applications that he has to review on a daily basis. So that's about very high level and very short review about what is in the pipe for the future development of the regulatory framework in Brussels, but also the legacy, which has been really virtuous for the industry, and I would say for the mechanical industry, because we are in control, we put safe equipment on the market, and the consumer can use a CE product where he knows that it has been assessed through all the existing legislation without too much paperwork to go through. Because I will say that with the tractor today, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of hours invested for very little value provided to the farmer. So
okay, well, thank you so much.
I'm a little provocative for Andreas, but I think that this is the purpose of the debate.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Christophe, for this very interesting presentation. Time is flying and we already have a lot of questions, but I have maybe one question, if you can answer quickly, Christophe, on that one. Could you maybe give us a hint on the current projects that are being developed? I'm thinking Gaia X, for example. Just a quick...
So yes, the sovereignty of the data is really at the core of the discussion right now for the European Commission. And there is a proposal from Germany and France about architecture of standards in order to develop new products which will comply with the new technology and particularly with the data generated at the sensor level. So this is really a good proposal. Now we need to understand how it will be implemented, developed. Will it be some kind of guidelines? We still don't know, but it is some very good aspect of the future development in Brussels.
All right, thank you so much, Christophe. Okay, let's go to the chat and answer some questions. Those two questions are more addressed to you, Andrea, about insurance. You gave us a little word on that, but there's one question: do insurance have a role to play in the uptake of robots? And the second one, as far as I know, engineers, designers are also personally liable for their work. You showed a way companies would take overall insurance for the product, but does this also cover the engineer's liability?
So, very good. Yes, insurance does play a relevant role. It's an essential tool. However, it should be a flawed approach, that of thinking that you can solve everything through insurance, because insurance also have two problems. One, they have to have a market, and also they need to be able to calculate exactly the risk. Now, on some things we have relevant data accumulated over the years. The best example in that perspective is that of cars, vehicles circulating on public roads. In many other cases, that might not be as obvious. For instance, even if you just consider advanced cars, the kind of harm that that might be caused because of the malfunctioning of some self-driving mechanism, the likelihood of its occurrence is not known. There is actually a statistical study from 2016 in the US that says that we cannot statistically say that driverless cars will be safer than non-driverless ones. We know that it will be the case because taking out the men from the driving loop will avoid all certain kinds of harms. But this doesn't solve the problem of having to identify the frequency with which other form of harms occur. Nowadays, accidents are due to human error, but once there is no human error, there will be other causes, for instance, hacking, that might be causes of harm. And it's very hard to anticipate with what frequency and with what consequences. So this is a constraint of that we face when we think of adopting insurance as a tool to solve all problems. I do believe that it is a very useful tool in the sense that if you identify one single point, entry point for all litigation, that could be the producer, then once you have that, you have identified clearly the party that can insure, and that can transform an ex post uncertain cost, that of litigation, into an ex ante certain cost, that is the premium that you pay to the insurance company. And that would simplify very much the mechanism, the compensation mechanism, and would reduce litigation costs. There would be much less litigation. However, as I said, there are some problems applying insurance as a one-fits-all solution in all cases. We need to be a little bit more analytical. Maybe it could work in agricultural robotics, and in general, it could be applied to all such cases where the kind of harm is easily that might be suffered is easily identifiable ex ante. So when you can kind of anticipate the possible interaction between the machine and potential victims. So that might be the case for agricultural robotics. The liability of programmers and producers, and engineers, yes, they could be personally liable, in particular if you consider criminal liability. However, conceiving criminal liability is much more difficult because it typically requires negligence or scienter, so the willing commission of the crime. So that I don't think will ever be the case. I don't think that there will be some crazy engineer programming the machine to kill. But yes, there might be personal liability, but ultimately I don't think that anybody will sue directly the engineer that programmed the machine, because ultimately it is the producer's liability. Even today, with the current legal framework at European level, that is responsible for all harm resulting from the use of the product that they sell on the market. So eventually you could conceive some forms of action in recourse. So basically the company that is held responsible later might decide to sue the engineer that programmed it. But I don't even know whether that could be possible under all circumstances. And there are many things that would need to be taken into account. So I don't see the engineers as being the primary target for civil liability claims. It could more likely be the owner of the technology that uses the technology, or the producer. Theoretically should be the producer, but it's very hard to hold the producer liable in light of existing legislation. So very often litigation will be targeted towards the owner of the technology that uses it. And if that legislation is passed at European level, it will be, all litigation will target the operator. And who is the operator? That is a difficult question to answer, because it might be many different kinds of persons. It could be really the single farmer that owns his own tractor, or it could be the large company that is industrially farming, or any service provider that provides some kind of services involving the use of the robot, and any other intermediate solution. So, and even in the same litigation, there might be more parties that are all deemed the operator of the technology. So this is a little bit complicated, and this is one of the reasons why I believe the proposal of the European Parliament should be somewhat reconsidered.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. There's many more questions on that issue on the chat, but I'm afraid we won't have time to answer those. But maybe one question for Christophe more. The resolution of October 2020 does not seem aligned with the current draft of DM revision definitions. I'm afraid of the calendar. Do you know how this works on liability articulate themselves with other working group, especially the one about Machinery Directive?
Today, I mean, I used to participate to the working group of the Machinery Directive, and the latest meeting that I have attended was clear that for the mechanism which is used today with harmonized standards, the pace at which the standards are published is not good enough, and we have a problem to keep up with the pace of the evolution of the technology. And that's the reason why the revision of the Machinery Directive, which has been assessed, and today we are at the level of the draft of some propositions. And I know that Rob Agri and the French government, the two of them have already made some proposition through the representative of France. And that's the reason why they have covered some aspects of artificial intelligence into the Machinery Directive, where we will have certainly the use of the previous mechanisms that we used in the past. So harmonized standard, presumption of conformity, technical files produced, but without reviewing all the other legislation. So there was no clear link with the other legislation when the proposition were made, except for radio equipment directive, low voltage directive, where we had some overlapping between this legislation. So no clear link with the liability, and I'm not a lawyer, so an expert in this domain, but more on the standards side.
Well, thank you very much, Jen, Clement. Thank you to you both. Just as a reminder, you can meet in the networking room to pursue the conversation and address more of the question. If you can stick around to the end of this session, there might be other questions that will be asked to you both. But I want to move to the second part of this session, the round table, the automation of field tasks leading to the advent of a new agricultural production represents a significant challenge in the organization of the sector. But concretely, what will this change in the professions of each player, from the technology supplier to the dealer through agro-supply? How will the market and the legislation have to adapt? So for each of them, what does an agricultural world mean in which tractor drivers no longer exist? In this next roundtable, we'll address such issues such as, for example, is it possible to replace everything to move to autonomous robotics? Or what are the needs in terms of collaboration, skills, interactions to achieve this, and on what subjects? Or our intelligent robotics implements the inevitable next of agricultural tools, or agricultural robots, is it really a cost-effective ultra-precision revolution? Or the handling of autonomous machines requires special training, but who has to train whom? Let me introduce you to our next panelists. I'm very proud and happy to welcome Antoine Chatelain from Chatelain Nursery. Pépinière Chatelain's activity is a vegetable growing business and a traditional farming with tractors. Antoine, you use robots for the pépinière activity, essential for the widening activity. You are, in a way, a testing lab as well as a final user. You've been using robotics for quite a long time, and you say you're open to collaboration with labs. Eventually, you would like to become a test platform. Today, you will give your point of view as a final user, as well as someone seeing and understanding both sides of robotics. And you also have a good vision of robot conception, as well as a good technological knowledge of robots in the field. We are proud and happy also to welcome Aymeric, CEO of Naïo Technology, a company that develops and markets multitask robots dedicated to the agricultural world. Also, Naïo is hosting FIRA team during these 3 days. So thank you very much, Aymeric. You will tell us in a moment if the value proposition of an autonomous robot expresses itself in all situations. And how about the issue of the distribution versus returns of the farmer? I'm happy to welcome Gordon CLEMENTS, General Manager Solutions at VARTA Storage GmbH. VARTA Storage is a leading manufacturer of energy storage. Gordon, you have a 17-year experience in the battery industry, focused mainly on lean sales management, and you're now General Manager of VARTA Storage GmbH with P&L responsibility for power and energy product line. From a power perspective, you supply battery for robotics. You will tell us in a minute what you think are the new challenges specific to automation. And lastly, we're happy to have also Greg Meyers with us. Greg is Chief Information and Digital Officer of Syngenta Group, responsible for all technologies and software. The Syngenta Group is a global agricultural technology company that produces agrochemicals and seeds. As biotech company, it also conducts genomic research. Greg, you will tell us in a moment how you apprehend the autonomy of agricultural robotics. What does it change for you? Etc., etc. Let's start with Antoine Chatelain with one first straightforward question. Antoine, tractor without driver, what is your position on that?
So my position as an end user, I would think that some part of the job are already automated. We'll see a tractor using GPS to guide themselves in the field, but what we see as what we see in the field is that not all tasks can be automated with current technologies. But I think that AI and other systems can greatly improve what we can do, and I think in the end we will only be required to do only part of the job, and I think this part of the job will be reduced greatly by artificial intelligence and autonomous tractors and other vehicles.
So do you think that autonomous robots and decision support tools will totally replace farmer intervention in the field?
I mean, with assistance, they will not be replaced. Some part of the job will be taken by AI and robots, but some part need human expertise on some delicate subject. I mean, weeding robots, they are already developed and they are kind of working. So this part is already automated. and we can see that part of automation growing. But I mean, on the decision making, I think that the decision will be enhanced by support decision platforms, but not totally. The farm will not drive by itself. The human will still be in command, and we also have other jobs coming into agriculture, such as robot engineers and teams to repair the robots. So all those jobs, I think, in the foreseeable futures, will not be taken by AI and robots.
From what you see, Antoine, from your perspective, in which situation is there a greater value proposition? Which applications or autonomy have the most value from what you experienced?
From what we experience, a very repetitive task, such as weeding, I think the value proposition is really high, because it's a part of the job that when you can't use pesticides, you need to do this by hand or using mechanical machines. But if you do it by hands, you will use it is a physically intensive work and not a very rewarding one. So you don't return home after a day of work saying, yes, I weed a lot of land, but other parts where you need only spontaneously people, I think those one will not be the automation will not take over, because the volume of work that needs to be done need to be quite significant to justify the investment in new machines.
Mm-hmm. Aymeric, I'm turning to you, Aymeric BARTHES from Naïo Technology. In response to what Antoine just said, what is your position? Does the value proposition of an autonomous robot express itself in all situations?
Well, hello everybody. Probably it's just a matter of time. We have probably two perspectives of time, short-term and the long-term vision. But just to remain what Antoine said before, I think the main challenges we can address with the robotics is, as he said, repetitive tasks, but also all about the environmental aspects, eating healthy food, for example, but also on the labor shortage point of view, and also about how producing enough food on the limited areas we know, and yes, for the growing population in the near future. So everything of this, every of these points, of these challenges, I think the robotics could bring a solution. And it's a matter of time, as I said, but I think we can already respond to these challenges in the short term, speaking of specific crops. And in some specific cases, so maybe for vegetables, because I know very well vegetables, and I know also well vineyards. I think the robotics, and I'm pretty convinced that robotics brings solutions in the short term. Cause
what is the short term? What is the short term, Aymeric?
Sorry.
What do you mean with short term? Is it 10 years? Is it 5 years?
It's now. It's now. Okay. Yes, it's now. It's perhaps 1 year ago. Okay. Yes, because we already see a lot of robots in the field. Speaking of vegetables and vines, there are a lot of examples in Europe and also in the US, also in Australia. So yes, I think it's really the short term for that, and I think the most important thing we have to keep in mind, it's the safety. And the safety, speaking of the safety, it depends about the the speed of the robot. It depends about the tall of the robot, the size of the robot, etc. And I think for specific crops, like vegetables, like vines, maybe others, it's already something we can bring with robots, with small robots, with very low speed robots, and we can fit with the regulation. If we can put a supervisor beside the robot, and in the time, and maybe I hope in 2 or 3 years, without supervisor beside the robot. But it's already possible, and there are so many examples that is yes, already possible.
We'll talk more about the safety issue, of course, but one last question before we hear Gordon Clements. What about, Aymeric, what about the issue of the distribution versus the returns of the farmers?
Oh, it's a good question. Thank you. Distribution is really important for kind of people like us at Naïo Technologies, because they represent the network we need to sell our robot, and it's complicated to make that without them. But we made some issues with the relationships between the distributors and the customers of the robot, because using robots needs to really train a lot with the robots to understand how it works, to understand how integrating the robot in the fields, setting up the robot in the right configuration, and we have also technical support integration to do in the time when you use the robot. So we have a lot of things to do, and the training is really key, because we have to train a lot our distributors, and we have also to train a lot the users. And the distributors will be really autonomous in the training, and able to make the training without the robotics provider, when they will be able to sell enough robots to represent a fleet, and better understanding how the robot works, and make some habits for the distributor. So yes, the main issue we have is probably around the training, because we need to really work with the distributors to train the customers of the robot, and because it's really key. The more the robots are used, the more the clients are autonomous with the robot, and the more they are confident with the robot, and the more we have no issues with, no fear, no issues with safety, etc.
All right.
So, yes,
thank you, Aymeric. Gordon, I'm turning to you. As a supplier, what do you think are the new challenges specific to automation?
So, my perspective is only from the power perspective. And when I consider from a power perspective, is farming with no tractor driver possible? Of course, it's from a power perspective already possible. But I see the challenges to consider the power not only as the battery, but the battery together with the charger, and the availability of charge, let me say, in the field, either from the grid or from a solar power station or from wherever. I see that this combination of charging and battery is probably the key to success, because it's not only in the robot that we need artificial intelligence or machine learning. Maybe we need artificial intelligence or machine learning in the battery itself, so that the battery can learn more about the regime, and together with the charger can optimize that regime, and maybe in the future that can result in smaller batteries, more optimized batteries. And if we go to standardized modular battery solutions, it means that the farmer, the end user, can consider only to carry standard spares and repairs, because the cost of ownership is also an issue that we need to consider in the discussion. But if we consider the tractor on the one side and maybe the robotics on the other side, on the tractor side, the investment that's required to produce a customized lithium-ion battery or any kind of battery for a tractor is a much heavier investment than is what is required for a robot, for example. And on the robotic side, it's much easier to enter the market if there's a standard solution available, a solution that can be used by multiple applications in the field, and again, which feeds to the farmer having to carry only limited amounts of spares and repairs. The issue is bigger as well when you consider the certification that's required. So if you look at the tractor versus the robot, the tractor looks more like an automotive application, and the certification that's required for automotive devices is much higher than is required for a robotic device. Of course, there's certification required for the robot, but in both cases, I think it makes sense to consider the charger and the battery together, especially from a certification perspective. If we can certify the battery and charger together, then it's much easier to go from one application to another application, and thereby we save cost over time. So I think in summary, from my perspective, from a power perspective, the big challenge is really combining the charger and the battery together, and bringing artificial intelligence or machine learning directly to the battery so that we can optimize the battery and the charger as we go forward.
Another question to you, Gordon, before we hear Greg. Aymeric raised the question of safety, the safety issue. How about the battery safety, for example? Can the energy that is being diffused represent any danger? I guess you have addressed this safety question.
Yeah, safety, there's a number of levels we have to consider safety. First of all, a battery is made up of chemical cells, electronics, packaging. All of these things have a safety element to them. So step number one from a safety perspective is that you have to select a vendor who's able to put these components together in a safe way. The cells themselves have to be manufactured on an automated production line to minimize the differences and discrepancies between each cell, so that when you combine the cells into a battery, they're easier to manage. Which brings me to the battery management system. The battery management system has to be designed so that the lithium-ion battery can operate within its safe window. And specifically at VARTA, we operate 4 levels of safety. And I guess later, if we introduce machine learning to the battery, we can introduce a 5th level of safety where we can learn how does the battery operate, how within this window, where does it actually operate within the window, and maybe we can narrow the window for each specific application. But then we come to the packaging of the battery. The battery, especially in the applications of agricultural robotics, is subjected to shock, vibration, pretty harsh environment in terms of the weather, rain, sunshine, direct sunshine. All of these have to be considered in terms of the packaging and how the battery is actually housed. And provided that you get all of these things correct and your vendor is able to deliver these things to you, then the safety issues can be managed in such a way that it represents a very small risk to the end user, if any risk at all.
Thank you, Gordon. Greg, for Syngenta, can you tell us how do you foresee the autonomy of agricultural robotics? What does it change for you concretely? How do you see the future? Is it similar, for example, as the self-driving car?
Yeah, I think it's very similar. It's probably important to point out that in many ways, agriculture is quite far ahead of consumers in this space. Tractors have been steering themselves for 20 years, which is farther along than consumer vehicles are. And for the record, tractors with auto steer better than human beings do with less errors, right? So I think this is a matter of time. I think what we see is the long-term opportunity here is, it's first probably worth pointing out that agriculture is a complicated endeavor. From the moment you put a seed in the ground, there's thousands of different things that could stop a seed's ability to reach its full genetic potential. And all those things require several hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions that human beings have to make. So in many cases, farming is still an art. It's something that relies a lot on intuition, judgment, experience. It's still very common for farmers to farm the way their parents and grandparents have done as they understand the land. And when you think about sort of as this plays itself out, really farming can be more like a science, right? Because we're talking about biological systems operating in nature, and they're going to follow the laws of science. But the ability to comprehend all the different nuances that make up why things occur, when they occur, and what to do about them are something that overall can be mathematicized over times. And I think much like autonomous driving, where it's not, there isn't an autonomous car and then there is. There's many different steps in between now and then. For example, today many cars they do have auto steer. You can be on a highway in a lane and they'll keep you within a lane. They have self-parking. There's adaptive cruise control. And I think this is sort of the evolution. It'll be very similar in agriculture, where there are bits of pieces that are easier to tackle. So it'll be, I think, a slow progression of more and more autonomous features and equipment. But I think in the long run, the idea here is human beings are not good at managing a lot of variability. They're good at averages, and farming today is still a lot of averages. You apply, pesticides are still largely broadcasted. You apply a similar thing across the whole field. You seed your field the same way. Everything is based on averages. But in the long run, you'll be able to perceive relatively small differences in subplots of land and potentially be able to do something different plant by plant. That's not something a human being has the cognitive ability to do, but it is something that I think computers and data science and ultimately machinery, as they work together, unlock a completely new opportunity to radically change the way agriculture is done. I think maybe the last thing I'll say is there's quite a lot of energy around regenerative agriculture, which is this idea that you can create this maximum biodiversity on a field where you have healthy weeds and crops, and they're all working together to build the soil, to sequester more carbon in the atmosphere. But if you think about the why farming is the way that it is, with long rows of the same thing, and you try to make sure there is nothing other than what you want in that field, it's because it's efficient for human beings. So as autonomous equipment occurs, things like regenerative farming and biodiversity and being able to do mixtures of crops will be something that won't work if human beings' time is at stake. But the moment you don't need humans anymore to really spend the time sitting in a tractor for 8, 9, 10, 12 hours a day, I think is the moment you have the ability to really change the way agriculture is done, where not only can you help farmers be more productive because they're not going to rely on increasingly hard to find labor, but also they'll be able to farm more sustainably because they'll be able to maximize protocols that help build the soil in the ground, sequester more carbon, maybe remove carbon from the atmosphere, and also maximize the biodiversity of agriculture.
Greg, tell us more in detail. How about the robotic seed planting? How about the variable rate technology for precision seed planting?
Yeah, it exists already. Variable rate seeding is technology that has existed for quite a long time. but it's not widely used. First of all, not the average tractor or planter might be it has 40 years of life in it. So it takes a while for the equipment to turn over. That's a natural issue here. But even with farmers that do have, in places like Latin America and in the US, where you tend to have more higher sophisticated equipment, even the farmers that have variable rate technology, it's used on less than 20%. And the reason isn't because the machines don't do things well. In fact, the machines are actually probably well ahead of being able to navigate complexity. The issue is that you don't have the ability to write a prescription that is actually going to do something accurately is where the challenge is. So the machinery is actually already way ahead of the agronomics and the science to do that. And I think there's still an informational gap, or I'd say a white space in the fidelity of informational inputs that you need to make ideal solutions for a given farm. And then, of course, it's important to point out that farmers are very different than consumers, because they only have 40 times in their lifetime to get it right and to make a living and to pass along the farm. So they're not going to take a lot of risk on things that are unproven. And I think until the fidelity and the trust around how these algorithms work and they can demonstrate success on that particular field, not just in demos and tests, but actually on their particular field, it will take a while for them to build up the trust and be willing to take the risk, the production risk associated with relying on computers and algorithms to make decisions that, for them has largely been conventional wisdom and experience.
Mm-hmm. Aymeric, you know Greg Meyers because you are engaged in a partnership with Syngenta. Can you develop on that?
Yeah, of course. So we work with Syngenta. We've been working with Syngenta for 2 years now, and we've been testing one of our robots, the robots dedicated for vegetables. But we have made some tests, some trials for Syngenta on sunflowers. Just trials with the weeding tool. And we will continue to test that with Syngenta, and I hope we will also test different tools, and not only the weeding, because as Greg said, I think it's really possible to make seeding and planting with the robot, but it's probably not the easier task we have to begin with. So it's why the weeding was the first trial we made with Syngenta. But in the future, I hope we will have the opportunity to test seeding and planting and all the process with companies like Syngenta.
Mm-hmm. You also are engaged in a partnership. You recently signed a partnership with VARTA.
Yeah.
And Gordon.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I hope soon also with Antoine to make all the roundtable complete for us. So we have a partnership with VARTA. Speaking of the batteries subject, and because when we speak about robotics, as we said before, all the roundtable, we speak about the profitability of the robot, of the model with the robot, and the profitability of the robot could be really increased if we are able to drop the issue of the logistics. Because when you have batteries on the robot, you need to charge the batteries, and if you have to send someone to charge the batteries, you have a problem. You have an issue with the profitability of the model. So what we have done with VARTA is really something it's key for robotics. I think, and I'm convinced, and we are convinced in Naïo about that. It's we need to replace the action done by a human to charge the robot and make that autonomously, like a vacuum robot in the house. So we designed a trailer with autonomous charge solar panel on the trailer to charge the robots autonomously, and we've done this prototype with our small robot Oz, and it's a success for us because everything is going really right on that, and I hope we will be able to sell that to our customers in the next year.
Mm-hmm. So to both of you, Aymeric and Gordon, what are the technical and societal challenges, because there are societal challenges associated to the idea of a tractor with no driver? How about, for example, the logistics? When the battery stops, who's in charge? Gordon?
Yeah, I think the big advantage that we can offer to Naïo and to other companies in this market is that we offer this modular solution. And the more that we get the take-up of this module in the market, and as Aymeric mentioned, we also use the same module in the robot as we use in the charging station. So the farmer is able to replace modules rather than replace detailed battery. It means that the responsibility can be taken by the farmer. It's quite safe for him to take a module out and replace a module. It's quite safe for him to take a module that's been used in his tractor and use a module, the same module in his robot. And I think as well, when we combine the wireless charging with what we also have developed together with a third-party company for Naïo, it means that it's much more reliable. We can manage the charging regime, and like I mentioned before, if we can learn what does the power consumption look like, what does the profile of the power consumption look like, and what does the charging regime look like, and we can basically collect that data, and we can optimize then for each individual application, or even for each individual farmer, what's the best combination of battery, how many modules does he need? Does he need one, or does he need 2 or 3 or more? What does his charging regime look like? How much storage does he need in his charging regime? All of these things can be optimized, and I think that we're really at the beginning of this journey, not at the end. The other thing that's important is that for each individual application, for each OEM of a robot, it's necessary to talk to a standard battery module, but not all robots want to speak on the CAN bus, which is what we have as standard. So I think it's important for us to develop our universal CAN gateway, whereby we can basically implement any communication protocol that the end customer needs, and give him a completely integrated suite without him having to deviate from the standard module and to lose the advantages that he gets from having a standard module.
We have a lot of questions coming up on the chat, but I have maybe one last question for both of you, Greg and Antoine. Among the challenges ahead, which are the biggest ones for you? Is it acceptability, logistics, battery storage? Greg, artificial intelligence, how, for example, to pick strawberries, cereals, corn, rice? You say these machines still need a brain.
Yes, on very delicate parts, the biggest problem that we had so far is reliability, because sometimes the robot works great. We did not see any issues with the work. The robot did his job fantastic with great success, but on any moment notice, the robot can start going over your crops, can have some issues, can be in part attributed to wrong settings being entered, or sometimes environmental variables that are not really inclined with the robot. The ground may be too hard, too wet. You can have mud. So for me, the biggest problem that I saw with the robot that we tested is really reliability and cost of ownership at the purchased moment, because when you purchase those systems, they are still really expensive, but to run, they virtually cost nothing to run, because electricity is quite cheap, and you don't normally need labor to supervise. So for us, it's really reliability and the trust that we can put in those systems.
Greg, what is your point of view?
I don't have too much to add.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I think that covers most of it. I mean, I think it's important to understand that that on farms there's mud, and when mud and water covers cameras, they can't do their job. I mean, there's just a lot of practical realities, particularly in vegetables, which you referenced. Vegetables are in some ways easier because they kind of do, when you talk about harvesting, it's relatively straightforward. It's just mechanizing the same thing, but you'll need things like cameras. And if it's raining or you have cloud cover and the sun is different, I mean, it creates different kinds of practical issues. But I view all of this as really just maturity. It's no different than in self-driving cars today, where they can do some things well, but then as they get more and more time in the field, you're able to correct for some of these, sort of unusual things. But I think the things that are very, very repeatable, like seeding and harvesting, I think that the technology is already very mature. The artificial intelligence and the mechanics, I think the reality of us getting them to work at scale in Mother Nature is really the bigger problem.
There's a lot of questions in the chat, so we'll go into the chat. And there's a question especially for Aymeric. If an on-site human supervisor is needed to be with the robot, the economics of robot use is undermined. In many cases, if the human must be present, they may as well operate the equipment. Can robots be profitable for farmers if on-site supervision is required?
Yes, of course. If not, I have to stop running my business. So yes, absolutely. Because the model for the next 2 years, when we speak about supervision for the robots, is to be able to supervise several robots in the same time, in the same field. So the model is viable, is profitable if we are able, for example, in the US, I take the example of the US growers in vegetables in California, if we're able to operate 3 robots in the same field. Yes, it's profitable for the growers. It's also profitable if we provide the service with Naïo. So yeah, the key for the 2 next years, speaking of supervision, is to operate several robots in the same time to make the model profitable.
One question for Gordon. Another point, farmer often tries to first repair by themselves with 12 voltage batteries, no worries, but with from 75 or 600 voltage batteries, the risk is not the same. Please do not forget foreseeable misuse. The level of knowledge of electricity of farmers is not so high as for engineers.
No, this is true, and again, this points to the use of standard modules, self-contained modules, modules which have all the safety features that we discussed in the beginning, from the cell to the packaging to onboard environmental management. I think that if it comes to a robot, I don't see huge differences between a 12-volt battery and a 48-volt module, which is packaged in such a way that it's safe and easy for the farmer to connect and disconnect. A much different proposition if we talk about a 600 or an 800-volt battery in a tractor, which, I don't think it's realistic that people who buy electric cars are going to try to replace the the battery in their electric car, and I think the same thing applies to the autonomous tractor. I don't think the farmer's going to get a crane and remove the battery from the tractor and try to replace it with another battery, and I think it's not likely, but very likely and guaranteed almost that the manufacturer of the tractor and the battery are going to make it very difficult for that to happen anyway. But I don't think it's a realistic possibility. From the robot point of view, I don't see any safety issue in the battery being replaced by the end user.
Lots of questions on safety. This next one, safety question in Europe and in the US are tricky. In Europe, you need to have the CE marking. How about the USA? Do you have any NRTL mark? Which one in this case? And do you use driverless vehicles, Euro standards, for instance? Greg, maybe?
To me?
Yeah, or anyone who wants to answer.
From a power perspective, yeah, CE is important. UN certification is important. But I mentioned earlier that certification of battery and charger together to UL standards is something that we're not undertaking. We're actually in the process to get already. Things like UL 2595 and UL 2271, UL 2580, where you can certify the battery and charger together as one system. These things all guarantee safety of the battery, not only in Europe, but in the US. In Europe, we have IEC standards 63335 or 62133. All of these things apply to batteries and chargers to guarantee the safety of the end user.
A more general question here, anyone can answer that one. Wouldn't it make sense for the farmer to be liable as agricultural machines work in an environment that could be fully controlled by the farmer? This is very different from the automotive case in which vehicles are in public controlled areas. Greg, what do you think of that?
Yeah, that sounds like a question for a lawyer. I'm not so focused on, and I think we had Andreas here, and I'll leave that to Andreas to answer questions like that. I think I do agree with something that's been said earlier. I mean, if you look at, it's always risk versus benefit. I think if you look at most farms, they're relatively contained environments where it's a farmer and his land and maybe some wild animals. It's not the streets of Paris we're talking about here. So I think we either can focus on all of the risks and downsides, or we can focus on the opportunities. And it's my view that it's the regulator's job to make sure that as these things become widely adopted, and I'm sure that they will be, there's too much, it's just too compelling for them not to be. Then we have to rely on the regulators to do their jobs and ensure that the risks are balanced and that the safety protocols are put into place. But I don't have any doubts. Just like in the 1920s, everybody was worried about cars and all the issues with having 800-pound machines moving through the streets and hurting people. We navigated that. We'll navigate this as well.
But Greg, maybe this one question is more addressed to you, because you apply the same level of safety for automobile. Due to the risk of fire, the risk of collision are not the same, but risk of fire seems forgotten by robot designer. Agricultural work are very dusty and some are high risk of fire. We haven't talked about
I think Naïo might be a better person because they develop machines, but I don't. Again, I think whether I don't know that I would assert that there's a higher risk of fire as a fact. I mean, a Tesla car has 4,000 lithium-ion batteries in it, so I don't know that I would say for sure that that's a fact. But I might have Naïo, who builds machines for a living, maybe comment on that.
Aymeric? Aymeric, can you hear us?
Yes.
So that question...
Yes, you want my opinion
about
the question the fire. That's right.
Yeah, but can we overall compare the risk in the automobile and the risk in the automation in agriculture?
Okay. I'm comfortable with that. I don't know very well the perimeter of the vehicles automotive case in the public areas. But speaking of robots for fields, it's when it's possible, it's better if the farmer, if the owner of the field, is able to put some barriers around the field and some advertising on the field to just show that it's the robot running in the field, and if he is able to secure the field, it's pretty different with the automotive case, because you cannot just privatize the public area. So it's a bit different with a farmer, because in some cases it's possible for a farmer to privatize his field area.
Time is running very short with you, gentlemen. Time flies. We have just 2 minutes going on. Just the rest of the questions that are on the chat, we can, of course, meet in the networking lounge and answer those. But maybe one last message from Antoine Chatelain. Antoine, can you tell us, in the long run, I know that your Pépinière Chatelain's activity, eventually you would like to become a test platform. Can you tell us what are your expectations regarding that question today?
So regarding the fact that I want the company to integrate, I don't want the company to just move everything into that activity, but I think that we work with Naïo. We are developing in-house another robot with the help of Sunny. So I think that you need to have a dialogue between the end user and the people that are developing and building those machines, the robot, and also the artificial intelligence that I'm sure that is going to help us take decision. So the fact that so what we want to do is basically offer an opportunity, because we are close to Paris, only like 5 minutes from the Charles de Gaulle airport. So it's really easy to come by at the nursery, and we offer a lot of variety of crops. We have open field, a nursery, and vegetables, which is organic, so we can use any pesticides. So we are really interested with collaborating with universities, schools, and also companies to help everyone get on the same page and see what the expectation of a real life farmer can be, and not take decisions far away from the field. So yes, so this is what I think the advantage that can bring a test platform in Paris for robotics.
Well, thank you so much, Antoine. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm sorry we have to cut this session. We are at the end. It's 3:30. Thank you so much for your expertise, each of you. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and your participation. And again, please continue. You can meet in the networking room to continue the conversation. Thank you so much, and we'll see you a bit later. Bye-bye.